Hi, I'm Anthony Featherstone, and this is the Bridging the Gap podcast.
Hi, and I'm Gabe Martinez Cabrera. I am the Executive Director of LCMC, and we are here today with a very special guest, Rob Bajer. In a second, we're going to find out more about Rob's background, but part of the reason we brought him on today is because we're really excited to explore a topic that it seemed could, at first glance, seem a little distant from the work that adult ed does and that workforce development does as well, because it's kind of technology driven. And a lot of people don't know about microcredentials that work in our space. But one of the things we find is that, as is the case with a lot of things, technology can sometimes bridge the gaps and help speed up the process of helping folks who are often not, helped or not served. And we think that microcredentials might have some potential for workforce development and adult ed professionals in how to bridge the opportunity gap. So with that, Rob, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and get into what the heck is a microcredential?
You got it. So first off, it's a pleasure to join you guys today for the BTG pod, for the Bridging the Gap podcast. And my name is Robert Bajer, and I've been working on microcredentials for about the last decade or so. And I started out as an educator. I saw a real need to fix the way that learning is recognized and how it's applied. And that's led me down a relatively circuitous path to a nonprofit organization for which Gabe and I both worked. That's how I met Gabe. And that led me to a software engineering firm. And then I was a VP of innovation for a relatively large ed tech company here in Dallas, Texas. And along the way, I've been collecting stories and really celebrating some of the individuals behind those important projects that ultimately fuel socioeconomic mobility and connect learning experiences with career outcomes. So that's my elevator pitch there. And I can jump right into defining microcredentials. But before I do that, how'd I do, Gabe?
Wonderful. I love it. I'm just curious now. You can somehow explain what a microcredential is to someone who's never heard of that. And more importantly, tell people why people like Anthony and myself, folks who work in human services, why do we want to know about microcredentials? Why do we want to do that?
Yeah, so microcredentials are really exciting because they can fundamentally change the way that labor markets are addressed, specifically through the lens of, talent and opportunity and career outcomes, these kinds of things. So let me just start to define exactly what a microcredential is. So in a nutshell, a microcredential is a small, hence the name, award that recognizes progress and readiness towards some career outcome. So that's the one sentence description. Small, recognize progress, and recognize readiness towards some career outcome. So in human services, for example, the name of the podcast is Bridging the Gap. So what kind of gap are you trying to bridge? And exactly how can you bridge that gap in a way that's affordable, in a way that's flexible, and for many institutions and learning providers, in a way that's scalable, something that doesn't completely upend what they're doing, rather augments exactly how they engage with their communities and create additional and new entry points for different kinds of learners. But this isn't limited to, universities and colleges and things like that. There are professional development providers of all kinds that can leverage microcredential technology to improve the resolution that they recognize skills and then help individuals apply those skills in the pursuit of career outcomes. So that's like my slightly longer definition. And when I say skills and competencies specifically, which are the things that microcredentials recognize, we're not just talking about emerging skills and competencies, which is generally what fills the air, is, you're learning something new, you're getting a digital credential, it's a new technology. Microcredentials can also be used to recognize existing skills and competencies. So this is sort of anecdotal, but when I started out as a teacher, I was a biological sciences teacher at a high school in New Jersey, historically underserved community, largely immigrant population, inner city population. And I noticed that there was a disconnect between the way that I thought about what learning looked like and the way that my mom thought about learning. She had been a teacher for 30 years and I had just gotten started. And I thought, man, what a shame that the professional development that the district provides, it doesn't recognize emerging skills in the same way that it recognizes existing skills. So my mom, she probably has, a litany of skills that she's learned along the way that helps her be an effective educator. And I'm just learning. So why isn't there a system that can recognize both kinds of learning and connect those learning experiences with measurable outcomes within the district itself? So for me, that's really where it got started. And one of my litmus tests for a good micro-credentialing ecosystem, which we'll talk more about later, it recognizes both kinds of learning, new learning and stuff that people have already learned and apply every day, but maybe want to get recognized in a way that they can apply more tangibly for the future of their career.
Yeah, so I appreciate that tutorial, Rob. And in preparation for this conversation, I went to YouTube University, right? Because micro-credentials is something that I hear about a lot, but I'm still trying to learn more day by day. And one thing I noticed is that a lot of the information talked about incumbent workers, how you can, show that you're, learning a skill and developing professionally to move up in that career pathway. But you touched on K through 12 and that overview. And in K through 12, things are moving forward, right? It's no longer college or a bust. There's many other routes than 4-year education. You can do an apprenticeship. You can maybe take some micro credentials to get into career pathways. But tell us about where you think we are in that shift from 4-year college degree or bust to really embracing other pathways as a legitimate option, whether it's apprenticeship, but especially for this conversation,
right?
Micro-credentialing, which takes a strong ecosystem, which takes a paradigm shift in itself. So I know that was a really wide range of good to know your thoughts on K through 12, but adopting this for their seniors and students as a viable option post graduation.
Right. So, I mean, it's a great question. And just summarizing what I just said before I go into this next, response here is that the purpose of micro-credentials, again, is to make it easy for learners of all ages, including, learners in K-12 settings, students, right? But also educators leveraging the same technology. But the purpose is to make it easier for learners to capture, collect, and share those emerging skills and connect them with measurable career outcomes. So I want to ground everything I'm saying in that definition. I just want to reiterate it. And you'll probably tell that I was a teacher for a while because I'm going to repeat certain things, a couple times so that I can connect sort of our thesis for this conversation with the questions that come up. So first of all, think about micro-credentials like stepping stones. Okay, so if let's say I'm a senior, right? So you mentioned seniors, and I have a number of courses that I'm taking, and maybe I'm college bound, maybe I'm not. Actually, when I was in high school, my first impulse wasn't to go to college. I actually came from an underserved, area of New Jersey. I was actually interested in joining the military. It was the only way for me to get into medical school, which was my goal. So I didn't have the money to go. No one in my family really went to college. So I thought that getting involved with the Navy specifically was like a great way for me to pursue a non-traditional path into medical school. So I'm using that word non-traditional pathway. And I think what micro-credentials really do is they orient those stepping stones in a way that serves traditional career pathways. Okay, you graduate college, high school, maybe you go to college, and then maybe you get a job or you stick around and you get a master's degree or something. So I consider that a traditional career pathway or degree pathway, right? But then we have lots of non-traditional pathways towards employment. We have apprenticeships, like you mentioned. I was actually a teacher at a CTE high school. So most of my students, they would graduate from high school and they would get a job as a mechanic, or they would pursue a degree so they could become a nurse. So these were very career-oriented programs that I was, an educator in service to. So when it comes to thinking about the pathways themselves, I really divide those into two categories for traditional and non-traditional. And because micro-credentials can recognize each of those stepping stones, it's kind of like a GPS, right? Like I give you a map and I say, okay, I want you to get a job as, a mechanic, right? Like how many different ways can someone become a mechanic? And how are you sure that the direction you're headed is going to yield those results, those career results specifically? So that's what I wanted to delineate for your question there. And the downstream benefits ultimately are flexible, affordable, and personalized learning pathways that meet the needs of learners, but also, and this is really important not to get away from, meet the needs of the economy, of employers, of the people who are going to be procuring those individuals to do those specific jobs. And like I said before, microcredentials provide you with a resolution of skill or competence that a more macro credential, like a high school diploma, right? You graduated from high school. What does that actually say about your individual skills and competencies that might qualify you or even, enhance your qualification for a particular role? How do people know when they hire a mechanic that went through my class that they were in a focused CTE course? They were working on cars for years before they walk into that first job. Whereas maybe someone who went to a trade school or an association program or something, they went through a completely different pathway. And those pathways may lend themselves better for certain employers. And we'll probably get into this later, but where is the question? So, there are these.
What do you mean? What do you mean where?
Yeah. See, I piqued your interest. So,
well, no, because I think that's the question I want to ask. I kind of want to get into the more like, actually, how does this all work? Like, because I think if you don't know this, right, like, how does it work? I'm either a high school rising senior, and I want to finish school, or I don't, but I know I don't want to go to college, or maybe but I want to, and it could be I want to get a job in a trade, but I also could maybe want to get a job in IT, right? Which maybe doesn't require that I have a degree, a macro credential, right? So it means I need the skills. But then how do I go about channeling into this world of microcredentials? How does it look? What does it look like? What's the first step?
Right. So I'll just I'll start from the perspective of a high school senior, right? So you're graduating from high school and you decide, okay, I want to be, let's just use that example of a mechanic, because I actually had a lot of those students. And I taught biological sciences, to be clear. I actually don't work on cars, but there's a biology standard for all high school students. So everyone gets the science class. And one thing that I noticed with mechanics specifically, automotive mechanics specifically, is that cars are more and more like computers every single day. So, the traditional, mechanic training program looks very different than it did, let's say, 20 years ago. But a lot of the programs look the same as maybe they did 20 years ago. So if I'm graduating from high school and I want to get a job, let's say in automotive mechanics or even engineering, right? Like I have a few options. Sure, I can go to college, I can get a degree, it'll cost me a bunch of money, it'll take at least 4 years. Maybe I have to travel to go to a college. I'm from New York, so I very much take for granted the fact that, anything I want to learn is probably within 50 miles, but there are a lot of parts of the country, a lot of parts of the world that, if you want to become a nurse, right, then you might have to travel. You might have to go to a completely different country. So first thing I want to do is just ground the conversation in the where. So we were talking about microcredentials, and specifically this conversation is about bridging skills gaps. But when you go really deep down the skills rabbit hole, you notice that sometimes people call things the same thing, but they mean something very different, because we articulate skills through language, right? So like we call it IT, but IT might mean something very different, even to different companies. So here's an example. Let's say I want to get a role in IT, right? Information technology. Maybe I have an entry level certificate from a boot camp or an association. Maybe I have a CompTIA certification. Maybe I went to and I took some short skills courses. There are a lot of ways to engage with these things. And as far as I'm concerned, any micro learning, any small amount of learning that's recognized digitally and is career relevant, it actually falls under the category of microcredentials. So this is probably the biggest confusion in the microcredential space, as far as I'm concerned, is that a lot of people think microcredential as a brand. So if you take a micro-credential course, like there are literally things that are branded that way. But when I think about micro-credentials, I'm not just limiting what I'm describing to what a company or an organization decides to call a microcredential. In fact, in the United States, we don't have a common definition for what a microcredential is, but that's not the case in Europe. The European Commission has actually come up with a shared microcredential definition that anyone who calls it that has to conform to. So there's also this reality, and I think this is an introduction for most people on microcredentials. So I'll just say this. If you see microcredentials called one thing at a college and you see it called something different at a different college, you're not going crazy. There's no set standard for exactly what a microcredential course looks like, but there is alignment about the size of a credential, the career outcomes that are associated with that. They're generally non-degree bearing, but sometimes can be recognized for prior learning by a university and have credit awarded. But there really aren't any common rules of the road right now. And in some ways that makes the space really exciting. But it makes it tricky, again, for that person who's graduating high school and they see a microcredential and they go, what am I going to be able to do with this? So you have to pay very special attention to things like, how is the credential branded? Who's offering it? How rigorous is the course? Is this something you're just going to do online? You're going to take a few quizzes and they're going to give you a certificate? Well, if I'm an employer, that might not be rigorous enough. Now, something that prepares me for an official license, like, for example, the standard teaching certificate that I had when I was a teacher, well, that's a source of truth for employers. Okay, I was able to earn this license, and maybe a microcredential will help you do that. So if I'm a learner, that's one reason why I might take a microcredential, so that I can get into a licensing program that really is a non-negotiable. Maybe I want to be a project manager. Great entry-level job for someone at a high school, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe you don't want to jump in with PMI and pay a bunch of money and spend a bunch of time. Maybe you want to take a prep course, and then you find out, you know what? I'm interested in cars. I want to work for Tesla. Well, you're more likely to get a certificate in Six Sigma than you are in traditional project management from the PM Book of Knowledge. Maybe I want to work for a software company. I want to work for a Google or an Apple or maybe a small startup in San Francisco. I'm not going to get that job unless I have an Agile or a Scrum certification. So in some ways, microcredentials are small, they're affordable, they're flexible. They can help you decide exactly what pathway you want to pursue towards that career outcome. But very tangibly, you can share that microcredential online. It's a digital asset. You can add it to your LinkedIn. You can add it to your resume. It's something that an employer can refer to when they're trying to decide who the best qualified candidate is, especially if that microcredential has something like a portfolio attached to it, where you've demonstrated those competencies in ways that will prepare you for that job, and you can demonstrate that to your employer. So they look very different ways. There are different ways that people refer to them. It's not the same way across the world, but in the United States, that ambiguity can be a little scary, but at the same time, it presents a great opportunity, I think, because there are very exciting, innovative programs around the country cropping up, sometimes in places you wouldn't expect. And this reinforces this idea that microcredentials are in some ways a grassroots movement, but it's also a treetops movement. There's also like broad federal policy supporting this kind of technology. So I'm going to leave it there. That was long-winded. I'm famous for those kinds of answers. But I just want to stop, because I'm sure everyone's like, wow, that's a lot.
So that helped me, because as I mentioned, I'm learning about micro-credentials, right? And I guess because there's no standardization or standard definition of it, there's really a lot of micro-credentialing going on already. But we're looking at what's already happening, and then we're looking at micro-credentialing, and we're trying to figure out, is it one and the same, or is it, or is it apart? So that was helpful for me in kind of like connecting the dots in my mind. And it sounds like micro-credentialing is a way to expand access when we talk about bridging the gap to education and career opportunities. And one thing Gabe and I always talk about is that in Montgomery County, there's 20,000 plus unemployed individuals in our county. And if all 20,000 decided to walk through Gabe's door or WorkSource Montgomery's door, we wouldn't be able to serve them, quite frankly, because we only have so many resources when it comes to the 40, 50 warm-blooded people that work for LCMC and WorkSource Montgomery. So I really believe that micro-credentialing is the way of the future. I think that artificial intelligence is the way of the future as well, to make sure that there's equitable and expanded access to the masses, and not just the fewer aggregates of who can be served with live people. So I guess my question to you, Rob, is if am I on the right track as someone thinking about micro credentials? And number two, for a workforce development agency or adult education and literacy organization that really wanted to learn more and adopt or adapt to the micro credentialing, wave as a viable option for our customers, what would you recommend for us to do as step one?
Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah, so you mentioned a few things there. So first and foremost, I love that you mentioned like machine learning and artificial intelligence and neural nets and this kind of approach to scale. Specifically, is like, why would you spend any amount of time thinking about a complicated technical solution unless you had a very tangible outcome that you were seeking? And I think what you mentioned around the number of unemployed people, specifically looking at that number not as a monolith. So thinking about it as a series of discrete communities that have discrete persona profiles, like, for example, veterans, like, for example, people who are maybe elderly, for example, people who are learning English as a second language, or, you could even go so far as to say women, right? So like thinking about the pandemic affected employment in women 50% more than men. So if I wagered a guess, I would probably say if 20,000 people are unemployed, I would say probably 15,000 of them are women, I would guess. And if that's, in a line with the federal average, then it wouldn't be too far off. So reaching these communities is imperative, number one, but reaching these communities in a way that's high quality, affordable, and flexible at scale is exactly why you would seek those kinds of technical solutions. And I like to mention examples where I can. So there's the Economic Modeling Institute, EMSI. They are taking an approach to what are called skills taxonomies. So they're thinking very critically about what skills exactly they're bridging the gap for. And a lot of folks use like SOC codes, like ONET codes. And according to them, there's 1,000 jobs. Think about that. There's 1,000 different jobs. Okay, that's obviously false. There are a lot more jobs. And in fact, when people are training, sometimes they're training for jobs that don't even exist. So what MZ has done, and something that I really like, is they take a machine learning approach to creating that taxonomy of skills that micro-credentials can be created for. So if you're just using traditional ways of measuring employment, you're really limiting the flexibility and the personalization that you really need to connect those unemployed individuals with career outcomes in a way that's rapid, in a way that's affordable and flexible, which are generally the kinds of holistic approaches you would need to take for an underserved community. Otherwise, they would just do the traditional route. Nobody would be unemployed. So I just wanted to mention that example and sort of address that first question because I think it's a good one. And there are a lot of folks out there talking about blockchain, and they're talking about machine learning, and they're talking about, asynchronous, instructional coursework that's graded by computers. There's a lot of these kinds of high-tech approaches, but the why is kind of what I wanted to mention there. So the second part of your question is for an organization that wants to get started. The first thing that I would do if I was an organization trying to get started is I would look at some of the success stories. So you don't have to do it on your own. I mean, micro-credentials have been a thing for a decade. I thought about two specific examples that I would probably take a look at. So the first one is this organization called Education Design Lab. And they have a program called the Community College Growth Engine Fund. And the fund will result in employer-validated micro pathways, which is a new word. But think about those micro-credentials as stepping stones. Okay, they come together into pathways. Education Design Lab uses the word micro pathways because there really shouldn't be a lot of stepping stones to get that job. In fact, the shorter the stepping stones are, the more focused that's going to be, and the more flexible and, again, affordable the pathway is going to be. If we're creating micro pathways that are as long as college degrees, then like what value are we really adding? So they use the word micro pathways, which I really like. And specifically this program, the CCGEF, or Community College Growth Engine Fund, you can Google this, will result in employer validated. It's also important, employer validated. If the employer doesn't say that this is a good pathway, we're going to hire someone out of this, then what good is the pathway, as far as I'm concerned? So these pathways are going to be specifically designed to connect low-wage and entry-level workers to in-demand jobs that pay at or above median wage, and to put them on a path towards a degree if that's their choice. So I really like this. I really like this program. It's 6 of the nation's largest community college. They're coming together to create this cohort, and they're looking to surpass some of these goals by designing 30 micro pathways in the first year to get started. So the first thing I would do if I was someone getting started, I would look at some of these success stories. So that's one of them. The other success story, because I like contrast in my examples, if I can find them, is Walmart. So here's a really good example. Walmart Academy. First off, Walmart is the largest private employer in the United States by leaps and bounds. So first, you need to know that most people who work for a private company, work for Walmart, which is crazy when you realize that. You're like, wow, there's a lot of Walmarts. So they kind of have this huge number of workers, and generally they reskill and upskill more than 200,000 workers every year. And they're probably, going up every year, but they employ over 1.5 million people. And basically they built a Walmart Academy, which consists of micro-credential experiences that employees can do during the workday, get recognized for by their managers, people who know better than anybody what success looks like. And they can actually pursue, raises. They can move around in the company, and they have a number of pathways to do this. And I just wanted to mention private employers because they're probably some of the most innovative folks out there. I mean, colleges are doing what they're doing, which is great, but like employers are also an important resource for professional development. And instead of trying to do more than one thing, I have a job, I go to college. I mean, if more employers adopted these kinds of programs, or maybe they collaborated with associations or organizations, nonprofits, a lot of these actually groups start to pop up where there's collaboration between colleges, employers, and it's actually very exciting. The first thing I would do is just try to find those success stories. There's a couple other steps in there, but I just wanted to stop because, again, that was quite an answer. I wanted to make sure that there were no follow-ups.
No, that was great. I appreciate that.
Anthony, I'm sorry. Do you want to go?
No, go ahead, Gabe.
No. So I had a question. So it's related to that. So I do want to come back to the employer side in a second, because I think, and I'm sure that Anthony, especially in his position, heading up the employment agency basically for our county, has to think a lot about how do we make sure that if we're going to send, if he's going to send his clients or my students into the breach, right, and to try to go after those credentials, right, they have to be something that it's got value, right? So I think, how do we work that out? I think I'd like to come back to that. But I think before we even ask that, I guess I'm kind of curious if you could talk what you think the role is, and maybe that's part of it, right? Maybe the part of the role for adult ed and for workforce development professionals is not always just the get the student into the program, but it's like the support built into that. Because my only concern when we talk about like the K-12 idea, right? That student, or you, for example, right? You came out of school and you maybe didn't think you were going to go to college, but you definitely had a goal for yourself, and you felt like you wanted to find a way to achieve it, right? A lot of our folks, I think, especially the folks who come out, either immigrant populations or disconnected youth, especially in adult ed, sometimes they lack some confidence in themselves, or they don't know that path even exists for them. They might know the path exists, but they don't see themselves in that path. And I guess my only thought in this is, like, I know as an adult ed provider, a lot of times what I've said is, oh, my job is to try to teach you the path, or get you on the path. But maybe my role, if I'm using more of this micro-credential work, is to say, no, the path is there, And my only job is to make sure, help you navigate the path, as opposed
Right.
to being right, as opposed to being the leader on the path.
Yeah.
My job is to support your asynchronous learning, or to do the check-ins instead of me specifically, right? Instead of me, let's say, teaching you the content, maybe
Right.
my goal is to connect you with the content, which is online, and then just kind of like tutor you, check up on you, make sure that you stay on the path. And I could see the same thing with workforce folks. I don't want to speak for Anthony, but I could see some of that helping to scale it, right? Instead of saying that he's got to do the work, it's more like we're just the check-in folks who are keeping you on the straight so that you don't, but you're still doing it at your own pace and working through those courses and getting the work. And so I guess I'm opening that to both of you. Like, Anthony, I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you think that sounds like a suitable goal for for adult for workforce development. And then Rob, I don't know, I guess I'd just like to hear if you've got any ideas on that as well. Anthony, you go first.
Oh yeah,
you're a
sure.
workforce guy, so tell us.
I think you're spot on, Gabe. I think that's our motto as is right now. Coaches, counselors, walking hand in glove, shoulder to shoulder, whatever you want to call it, with our customers and developing the plan and helping them to execute that plan. So, I think you hit it on the head. Of course, I really want to circle back to the employer side of the house. That's where I think everything, is centered. If employers don't validate it and buy into it, then it's kind of for not. But before we get there, Rob, I'll pass it off to you for your part.
Yeah. So, Anthony, you and I agree. I think that what Gabe was describing is the right relationship between someone who's supporting, workforce from the perspective of training and recruitment, and really trying to set those folks up for success when the rubber hits the road and they apply for that job, that they get that job, right? And I've actually thought pretty critically about my role, since my role has changed over the last 10 years. So like I said, I started as the teacher, but then I became like a project manager building these programs for K-12 specifically. And then I sort of broadened out and I started building software and then working with universities internationally, working with more corporations. And I just was thinking, like, what are my own expectations for myself in the space? And the analogy, I love analogies because I grew up watching Star Trek. So I love a good analogy. I see myself a little bit like a Sherpa, like think about what a Sherpa does. A Sherpa is the person who shows up at the beginning of the trailhead and they make sure that you navigate the trail successfully. And they're not fortune tellers. They don't know exactly what's going to happen, but they have experience. They have experience that the person who's taking that trail for the first time, regardless of their capacity, right? You can be a well-worn hiker, right? You go hiking every week, but you do the Appalachian Trail. Suddenly you find yourself in Tanzania, right? It's an unfamiliar territory, right? So like when I use the analogy of a Sherpa, I really think of someone who is responsible for making that unfamiliar a little bit more familiar enough where it seems like a safe risk, a calculated risk, because it is a risk. You have these workers, they're spending time, they're investing energy. Maybe they have to get childcare taken care of. Okay, maybe they're a single mom. Like I grew up, I had a single mom. Maybe she's got a job, she's going to college, she's got things going on, right? Or maybe everything changes halfway through, right? Maybe you start off thinking you're going to go one way, but like a Sherpa, you encounter an avalanche, right? Then what do? Well, if you want to successfully complete the trail, you got to have a backup, and that backup has to be clear. So I think part of it is like help navigating, and then there's also the clarity aspect. And ultimately, all of this boils down to trust, really. It boils down to trust. You have to be someone that someone can trust, just like the pathways and the microcredentials themselves. That's why I don't think all microcredentials are good. Not all pathways are good. It's really up to the person who has a relationship with the individual to determine what the best microcredential or pathway is for that individual. And ultimately, what that's going to buy them is trust, which is what's going to get them to the end of the trail. It might not be what got them to start the trail. Maybe it's a more immediate ambition. But I think long-term, what's going to fuel the journey, right, is that trust aspect. And the only way to get that is with experience.
Yeah. So here in Montgomery County, a few of our post-secondary institutions are developing micro-credentials, which kind of started my path to figuring out what the heck is a micro-credential a few months ago. And it'll be grounded in our bio or life science industry, which is an intricate industry in itself when it comes to where are the entry points and what do you need to do to qualify for them. And after you get to an entry point, what's the next step and beyond? So I think it's great that we'll have some micro credentials offered at our 2-year and 4-year institutions here in Montgomery County. But it started with the employer buy-in. The employers are at the table on the front end of it, saying what skills are needed to break in the door and to move up once you get in the door. And I guess I'm just interested to hear your take, Rob, to see what it will take to convince or for the thought process to change for employers to buy into micro credentials on the front end, for entry points or entry level positions, so that you can have that gateway or career pathway to next step. Because we're starting in bioscience, but there's IT, there's healthcare, there's so forth, and some positions, categories, or whatever the case may be, 4-year degrees, terminal degrees, they're non-negotiable. But I think that we've seen our state take the first step forward in eliminating the degree requirement for thousands of state jobs here in Maryland. So I'm just interested to hear your take on how this will spread across industries and how we get employers to adopt it. I just mentioned that because I wanted you to kind of understand the context of what's happening at the state level and it's what's happening locally from a bioscience level. But we need that to transfer across industries, across many categories to truly, I think, bridge the gap. That was my plug for the podcast. So just want to get your take on that, Rob.
Yeah. So there was a lot in there that I really liked. The first thing that comes to mind, from the perspective of 2- and 4-year degrees, is that all degrees are credentials, but not all credentials are degrees. So first think about that for a second. So if you are credentialing a learner for a particular role with an employer, you're looking for a credential. And sometimes a degree is a very appropriate credential. A 4-year degree, I actually ended up going to college for biology. And it's because I wanted to get a job working as a scientist in a laboratory. And at the time, the degree was really the only credential that an employer, a biotech firm in New Jersey would accept, when I was trying to get a job. So there was really only one pathway for me. So that made the decision pretty clear. And then I had to navigate college, which was like a totally another thing, as like the first person to really go to college, in my family. So that being said, I also thought this would be a really good opportunity to talk about, the different stakeholders. So the university or the issuer of the credential, or the college, the issuer of the credential is one role. And it's pretty obvious, they're the ones who recognize the skills or competencies. They're also responsible for making sure that those skills and competencies are rigorously assessed. Because again, it's trust between the employer and the issuer, or in this case, a college or a university or a professional development provider of any kind, and the learner. That's really what connects those three: the learner, the issuer, and the recognizer. Recognizer, like someone who recognizes the credential and employer, right? So you have that sort of triad of stakeholders here. And I thought it was really important to break it out that way because sometimes simplifying the terms and finding definitions that aren't seem intuitively correct are a great place to start. And I think when it comes to getting that buy-in from employers, making that relationship really clear is something that some employers probably don't think about. They write job listings for things that they need, and they interview candidates that come through the door, and they have their own idea of what competency looks like. They have their own needs, demand, right? It's a demand for people with certain skills, and they're relying on professional development, training providers, colleges to supply them with well-skilled individual learners. So I think clarifying the relationship that a college or university or professional development provider has really is the middle ground. They're the bridge between learners and employers. I mean, there are lots of ways to learn things, I mean, you could go on YouTube and you can learn all sorts of things, but why does someone seek out a more formal learning experience, something that they're willing to pay for and spend time doing? It's because of that outcome. And it's really boils down to trust. So I think winning that trust is like step number one. Step number two is thinking very critically about skills. So like from the perspective of the issuer, right? Or a college or a university, someone who issues a credential to a learner. Okay. I think they need to really understand what those regional skills gaps are. What programs are you creating and why are you creating those programs? Well, the short answer is so you can address local, probably, labor market shortages. There's also, more broad labor market shortages like cybersecurity. I mean, everywhere needs better and more cybersecurity professionals. But I think when it comes down to some of the decision points for maybe low or medium skilled workers or folks who are just joining the workforce for one reason or another, or maybe they have experience and they're planning some kind of big shift, or maybe they're looking for a promotion, they really need that clarity. And so do employers. So all three of those people in that triad need clarity. And universities, people who provide those kinds of learning experiences can equip themselves with the kind of level setting exercises like identifying those stakeholders, getting buy-in from specific employers because they're trying to address very specific labor market shortages. Because then the value proposition is clear. Okay, we have 10,000 people, we have 10,000 nursing jobs. What is the shortest path to get these people well qualified, experienced, and career ready for those jobs with these particular employers? And I'm just going to shout them out again. MZ does this whole thing, Economic Modeling Institute, with skills clusters. And I'm not going to spend the whole time talking about it. You guys should interview them. They're really great. But skills clusters are a higher resolution way of figuring out what shape is that bridge. Is it a short bridge? Is it a long bridge? How many steps do you need? How rigorous does it need to be? What kind of assessment are we going to apply as like a university or a college? There are a lot of considerations, but there are some really simple places to start when you're creating, I don't know, like an employer network, right? If I'm a college, I'm probably using my career services, whatever that looks like, to connect with employers through some kind of employer network. That's how I would start the question. What are we all doing here? What are we trying to accomplish? And why, more importantly, are we trying to accomplish these things on behalf of our learners and the employers, really? So that's my long-winded answer again.
So I want to wrap the conversation up because I think there's so much to go. It's almost like I think we need to do another one of these that after Anthony and I have dug a little bit deeper, it seems like come back and do like an intermediate level. This is like the introduction class, but yeah. So here's the last question I guess I'll put to you, right? So I think I like what you're saying. And I think Anthony's example of the college taking that first leap with the biosciences is great, right?
Yeah.
But as a CBO, right, as someone who runs a CBO, and sometimes we're a little bit, so we have less resources, but we also can move more easily and adjust and change depending on need, right, that we see. And I guess the question I've got for you is, let's say that a CBO, someone who's running an organization that's built in the community, right, is saying, okay, I don't want to wait either, because it's true, we've got some progressive people at the college thinking through some of this stuff. So a community-based organization, is, for those of you who don't know, a CBO, for those of you who don't know, is a community-based organization. So it's just a nomenclature for a type of, you get human services, but it's just a group that's based in a community, right? So but let's just say that either we see a need that the college isn't recognizing or isn't able to adjust for, or you live or maybe you're serving a community that doesn't have a community college that is even thinking about microcredentials. Because I can imagine that for some, microcredentials could be a problem for some colleges if they don't think it through, right? Because they could see it as a threat because it's not a macro credential, right? So here's the question for you. Let's say that the Anthony and the Gabes of the world are sitting at home listening to this and thinking, okay, I don't have a partner, but I know some companies what can be done? Is there a first step? Is it open enough that there really is a first step for even at that level? Or do you always, are we still at the place where you still have a gatekeeper, a college, for example, that you have to go through to make this happen?
Well, I really
Does that
think
make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think that I really think those three stakeholders, you're going to bring people to the table to talk about your new program or project that you're thinking about getting off the ground, right? You got to have all three of those people at the table. You got to have the learner. You have to make sure that their voice is embedded in the experience throughout. You got to have the issuer. You have to have buy-in from your college. It sounds like Anthony has buy-in, which is great. It's probably like the hardest thing for a college to do, is to actually get everyone to agree to do this thing. And then finally, you got to have those recognizers. You got to have those employers at the table. So like first and foremost, that's step one. The second thing I wanted to mention here is that microcredentials should not be perceived as a threat to universities. In fact, an overwhelming majority of universities have already incorporated some kind of microcredential or short course into their existing curriculums. And they're doing that to address opportunities that exist in the traditional college or university experience. This is a standard upgrade for everybody, guys. Like, you got to upgrade the OS of your college. And basically that means you have to embed career-ready 21st century skills into your curriculum. Most folks who leave college, and this is according to Strata, do not feel prepared for an entry-level role. Think about that. You just went to college for 2 years or 4 years, and most people who graduate from a 2 or 4 year university do not believe that they are prepared for an entry-level role in their given field. So a lot of universities are addressing this by embedding microcredentials into their existing experience. So it's not
Rob, I'm gonna tweak you a little bit more. What I'm really getting at is,
right,
why is it still always going to a college? Because it's funny, because we're talking about microcredentials, right?
Right.
Which is a way of bypassing some of these more standard formalized forms of instruction. And yet the discussion still always seems to be looping back into colleges, which is kind of the institutor of the formal stuff. I guess my question is, if you're running a smaller educational group that works in non-traditional forms of education, meaning not rigorous, so I want to be sure I'm clear on that. But if you have a group who's in adult ed, you're in that in-between zone, right? You're not the institution of, you're not higher learning, and you're not
right.
K-12, right? And that's where the CBO comes in. The community-based organizations oftentimes are coming in to play that role, depending on the state. But in Maryland, you have some of that. So then how does can that group play a role in this without necessarily having the college buy-in? Because, like, I'll give you an example, right? The IT, like, there's an IT, I'm gonna do a little plug, Anthony, for our fledgling new and improving program. We have a program where literally we are working with ESL learners, right, to get them, and GED learners, to get them the first credential in the CompTIA suite, right? And then the idea is that we will then hand them over, do a warm handover to our partners at Workforce Montgomery, Anthony's group. And we will still support the student academically, because the student still has a ways to go academically to achieve parity with the people they're going to go against for those jobs. But while they're also getting that IT certification, right? Now, we use a third party that is accepted, that has a curriculum that then prepares the student for the credential. But they're not issuing the credential, they're just readying it. So all we're doing is preparing. In the end, the students still have to go and take the exam. So they're the issuers, not the subject, right? Because it's the issuer is freestanding, right? It has nothing to do with my region, right? It's a national issuer of that CompTIA credential, right? So I don't need a college then to do this. I'm able to create that system. I need an issuer, right? Yeah. And I know the issuer is trusted already, so I've already got that set. But so that's an example of doing it without a university. I'm just trying to wonder if there are other things you could do. Yeah. Let's say that you don't have the issuer straight, because in that example, the reason it works is because IT is built on the notion that it doesn't really matter what the credential is; it matters the skills you got, right? So if you don't have a college degree, but you know how to hack, then you're gonna code, then you can then come and join us, right? We're going to hire you, right? It has that tradition set up, but are there other fields where this could be done without a university doing it? I guess that's the question. How would that happen?
Got it. So
sorry,
that's a really good question. No, it's a great question, because my favorite use cases are ones that don't involve universities or colleges. For them, it's very clear the value proposition. They can offer college credit. There's a lot that they can offer as an accredited institution that maybe a CBO doesn't have access to, but they want to create an equally impactful and accessible program that gets folks from, what they want to where they want to be, right? So here's what it boils down to, since this is our introductory podcast, right? It boils down to currency. So think about a college degree. Let's just go back to that. I know I keep talking about it, but it's like the easiest, most tangible example. Why is a college degree valuable at all? Right? Why? It seems like kind of a crazy question, because we all very much take for granted the prestige and, the perceived quality and rigor of a college degree. But ultimately, it boils down to a few things. Number one, it boils down to the brand of the university. The university is accredited. It's a brand. Are you going to go to Stanford, or are you going to go to Kane University, a commuter school in New Jersey, right? One has more currency than the other. And you don't need to know why, but I think most people would recognize that fact, is that certain thing has prestige. So if I'm a CBO, right, and I don't have access to that same currency that comes with an accredited institution, I would think very carefully about what does add currency to the credential that I'm giving people. Because that's ultimately what it is. It's career currency. It's a thing that a learner exchanges for a career opportunity. So what contributes to the currency of your program, of your credentials? Here's a couple things. Number one, maybe a brand. The issuer matters. If Robert Bajer issues an IT certificate, who cares? Nobody knows Robert Bajer, right? But if MIT awards it, okay. So we know that brand matters. And there are a lot of reasons why brand matters. We don't need to go into it. The other thing is, what's the outcome? That contributes to the currency of the credential. If most people who get this credential get a job in IT, then that credential has currency. It has career currency specifically. And it's going to attract learners. It's going to attract employers. And it kind of is it's like a positive feedback loop when it comes to currency. So the more rigorous your award is, the better it's going to match candidates with careers, and the better job those candidates are going to do once they get those careers. So thinking about that feedback loop is what I would try to do as a CBO. And CBOs actually have some advantages that national networks don't have. So for example, most people who get a job are getting a job within 20 miles of where they live. So if you're creating a network of employers, and maybe they're not the Googles and the Facebooks and the IBMs of the world, but you have an employer that everybody in town knows, then suddenly you have, and this actually is really good with hospitals, like medical hospitals, nursing, places where healthcare professionals might work. We have, what is it? The UNT here in Texas, right? We have the University of North Texas. They're associated with a number of medical schools, colleges, hospitals, these kinds of things. So in Texas, where I happen to be right now, that has a lot of currency, especially if I just want to get a job up the street. So kind of the crux of what I'm talking about here is, if I'm a CBO and I'm looking to create some credentials with some career currency, I'm going to think very carefully about where that currency comes from. And it's tied to a number of things: the brand, the rigor. It's also tied to the career outcomes, to the number of recognizers, specifically employers. If this is a career-based credential, employers that recognize the value of that certificate. There are a number of ways that I can create high quality, high demand credentials without getting colleges involved whatsoever. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good example. Yeah. What do you guys think of that one?
I think this has been really, really helpful. Again, I can tell you one thing, Robert Bajer, to our millions of viewers, your brand means something here in Maryland now. Maybe outside of Maryland, we don't know who's viewing, but I think we could do this all evening, Gabe. I feel like I've said that before, which is a good thing. But I think we're coming short on time. So Robert, I just want to say thank you. This has been super helpful, and I'm open to a part 2, 3, or for me, I may need a part 4, 5, or 6. This has been extremely helpful. I've learned a lot about micro credentialing, and I think we have a lot of takeaways that have made us a little smarter at the end of this meeting than we were at the outset. So thank you. And I think we'll wrap up with just saying I'm Anthony Featherstone from Worksource Montgomery with my colleague.
And I'm Gabe Martinez Cabrera with LCMC, and I second it. I definitely want you back, Rob. We got to have a bigger conversation. I know that we mentioned this. If you've watched this podcast before, you know that one of our friends of the pod is Brent Stubbs over in Georgia. So we'll say hi to Brent. And Brent is kind of like the Waldo of anything interesting in this field. He's like, where is he? You can find him somewhere on that page if there's an interesting program going on. And I know that he's also interested in microcredentials. So we might get him for a phase 2 and listen to what's happening in Georgia, because I think it might be an example of how we kind of push it to the next level. So I really appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you for listening and watching. This is Bridging the Gap, BTG Pod, and we thank you very much for tuning in, and we look for you on the next one. Thank you.